The importance of a well-written protagonist and antagonist are central to the success and appeal of a good story. One of the factors that distinguishes a good story from a great one is the care and love that goes into the crafting of the side characters. A story that has a strong, well-developed supporting cast grants a sense of depth and gravitas to the world they belong to. It's easier for the audience to immerse and lose themselves in the world that the author weaves around them if the characters that inhabit it feel more alive than mere ornamental placeholders. One of the best examples of this is the anime manga Claymore, illustrated and written by mangaka Norihiro Yagi. The manga for the series ran for a total of 115 chapters, which have been compiled into 27 volumes and were published between 2001 and 2014. The series also received an anime adaptation, which covered the first 11 volumes of the manga as its source material, with the final 2 episodes providing a drastically altered ending to the story. Although the anime, under the direction of legendary director Hiroyuki Tanaka, who's previously worked for shows like Attack on Titan, Ninja Scroll, and Super Dimension Fortress Macross, does a stellar job capturing the essence of Norihiro Yagi's art and intent. The ending is far too rushed and doesn't hold a candle to the original ending of the manga. The anime is otherwise very well made, with many wishing that it had received more episodes in order to flesh out the series. For those who have their interest piqued by the anime, we highly recommend checking out the manga. It'll not disappoint you. In Claymore, Norihiro Yagi creates a world that is dystopian to its core, but feels extremely lived in, thanks to how he's handled almost every single character that we meet during the course of the series. While Clare's story drives the plot, the journey is filled with humans and monsters of all kinds. It's through her interactions with them, whether it takes place in the form of conflict or kindness, that we get to see the story develop into the beloved gem that it is. This interaction that we've mentioned would feel extremely hollow if the supporting cast were mere one-dimensional characters. Instead, due to how painstakingly the world has been set up, from the fears and trepidation of the characters to their ambition, unique powers and interpersonal relationships, the audience can't help but get invested in the world and its denizens. Claymore is not for the squeamish or the faint of heart, and is definitely targeted towards a much more adult audience, as it contains themes of nudity, violence, and gore. Norihiro Yagi's Claymore is a world that is truly alive. Due to the world being extremely well crafted, things such as the power hierarchy are clearly defined by the author in Claymore. We have some of the most broken and powerful characters in anime manga within this series. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the strongest beings that inhabit this fantasy world, 14 of them to be precise. These are some of the characters. If you dwell in the world of Claymore, you definitely don't want to come across them or get on their bad side. The list is in no particular order for the most part, as there are some characters that really muddy the water if we were to do a strict ranking. So, without further ado, let's jump right into this list as we navigate the perilous realm of Claymore, and let's hope that we come out on the other side with our innards intact. Matata, the Blood Eye. Matata is the rank 4 warrior of the organization during the period of the final battle of the series. She's still a child, but is touted to be a battle prodigy with the potential to easily become the rank 1 warrior. We find out that the reason she's not been given that rank is primarily due to her fragile mental state and instability. Not much is revealed to us about Matata's past, other than the fact that she used to live with her mother, who raised her by herself. At some point, her mother was killed by a Yoma, after which she was taken in by the organization, who transformed her into a Claymore. Owing to the trauma of her mother's death and the harrowing procedure and training she had to endure, Matata is extremely mentally unstable. In some ways, her character reminds one of Priscilla when she was still a human being. She seems to have, therefore, been shunned and feared by her peers and the organization alike until the latter delegated Clarice, another Claymore, to be her keeper. Since Clarice was considered a failed experiment and was extremely weak, the organization thrust Matata's responsibility on her to see if she could perhaps tame the child. If Clarice succeeded, he could at least be useful to them in some way, and if she perished, they would have gotten rid of another faulty product. Matata, however, takes to Clarice and grows extremely attached, only listening to Clarice's instructions. They develop a deep mother-daughter relationship, which helps to bring about a marked improvement in Matata's mental health. It grants her the means to focus her deadly skills that earned her the name Blood Eye towards foes, warranting her fury. In combat, Matata is shown to have prodigious movement and battle sense. In fact, this ability of hers is described as a sixth sense, with which Matata is able to track her opponents without the help of Yoki. The closest thing it can be likened to besides a sixth sense is pure instinct. She can track her foes, whether they're warriors or Yoma, and gauge their strength and use it to her advantage. This makes it possible for her to suppress her Yoki and still maintain unparalleled situational awareness in the heat of battle. The only ones who seem to have this ability are Terasa and Priscilla. Upon awakening, Matata's powers are said to be at the level of the Abyssal Ones. For those who are uninitiated to the world of Claymore, Abyssal Ones are considered to be the strongest monsters in existence for most of the series. They're generally a result of rank 1 level warriors awakening. In this form, she's seen being able to take on another powerful awakened being called Europa, who herself was said to have been at the level of an abyssal being. There is an argument to be made that Matata probably has the most potential for growth out of all the individuals on this list, both humans and monsters alike. What she lacks in experience, Matata more than makes up with her raw power, talent, and Yoki reserves. And after a seeming improvement to her mental stability by the end of her battle with Europa, the sky's the limit for this tiny powerhouse. Hysteria, the Elegant. Considered to be one of the 8 strongest number 1 ranked warriors in the organization's history, Hysteria is one of the most powerful beings in the Claymore universe. Hysteria is seen as being obsessed with the idea of perfection and aesthetic sense. Hysteria seems to have a haughty demeanor, looking down upon those with techniques she considers ugly or unappealing to her, like in the case of Miria's reckless attacks to defeat her. Hysteria also seems to crave other people's attention when they're in her presence, expressing obvious irritation and anger when it's not given to her. She explicitly mentions to Miria during multiple instances of their conflict that she hates being ignored. Hysteria's technique is supposed to be the most beautiful fighting style to have ever been created up until her time. The secret to this technique was her extreme speed. If it just came down to speed, she's undoubtedly in the top 3 fastest warriors of all time. Her fighting style is very similar to Miria's phantom technique. She increases her speed dramatically by initiating a momentary burst of Yoki on her legs. The speeds that she achieves are so great that she can create after images. Unlike Miria's technique, which she uses primarily to disorient and dodge her opponent's attacks, Hysteria uses it in a much more direct and offensive fashion. She uses her sudden burst of speed to close the gap between her opponent and herself, with extreme precision, slashing her foes as she breezes past them. The speed and accuracy with which this seemingly simple attack is executed is so great, Hysteria appears to be phasing through her opponent, even as her enemy succumbs to her sword. The event, called the Massacre at Rockwell Hill, is one that lives in infamy in the annals of the organization's history. The organization had sent in warriors to purge a Claymore who had refused to send out her black card, which is used to ask one of her peers to euthanize her due to being on the verge of awakening. This warrior slaughtered all her sisters who came to kill her, and it said there was a small hill of corpses created by the body of the fallen. This warrior refused to accept her fate was none other than Hysteria the Elegant, who, having come to the end of the line, refused to accept her fate. It's speculated that being so obsessed with perfection and aesthetics, along with being supremely prideful of her own elegance, she was ashamed to show her fellow warriors her current condition. We also think she just couldn't bring herself to accept the fact that she wasn't as perfect as she'd convinced herself to be, refused to accept a condition. It is said that she expressed shock and betrayal at how easily her fellow warriors turned their blades on her. She would have most likely killed everyone, if not for a newly recruited warrior who would go on to gain the moniker of the Faint Smile, who injured her leg, robbing Hysteria of her speed. The killing blow would, however, be dealt by a warrior called Rosemary, who would temporarily succeed her as the number 1 warrior. Later, she'd be resurrected by Day as part of a trio of former number 1s to be awakened as abyssal beings in order to quell the Claymore rebellion. In her awakened form, power of flight, godlike speed is further enhanced. She's seen taking on several single-digit ranked warriors of the current generation, along with the members of the Ghosts of the North, who are all as strong, if not stronger, than single-digit class warriors themselves. Hysteria is one of the most legendary warriors in the Claymore mythos, and lives up to the stories of her strength. During her first life, if Terasa hadn't been there to stop her rampage, she probably would have awakened like she would do later on as one of the strongest abyssal ones. Her place is therefore very much justified in this list. Ricardo, the Silver-Eyed Lion King. This male warrior was part of the first generation of Claymores and was ranked just below Isley, who would go on to be the Abyssal of the North. The name Ricardo has some etymological relationship to Ricardo in Italian, which further might allude to Richard, as in King Richard the Lionheart. This would make sense if one were to take into account Ricardo's awakened form, which is of an anthropomorphic bipedal lion. During the Battle of Pieta, he's one of the first real single-digit awakened warriors that Clare doesn't battle against. His strength is immediately shown as being overwhelming as he proceeds to cut a bloody sway through the warriors present there. He's seen cutting down powerful warriors like Undine, Jean, Flora, and Veronica, all of whom are either single-digit or just outside the single digits effortlessly. Ricardo shows a high battle acumen and intelligence as he recognizes Miria's plan of dividing the Claymore into groups led by the strongest warriors instead of putting all the strong warriors in one group. This is what leads him to go on his killing spree where he targets only the powerful warriors in order to break the Claymore's morale and destroy the chain of command. We also know that he's the second last warrior from the first generation to awaken. During his time as a warrior, Ricardo's shown being obsessed with the ranking system of the Claymores, as he refuses to acknowledge Isley as his superior, since they haven't fought against each other. After being defeated by Isley, he joins the Abyssal One of the North as his right-hand man. His obsession with strength and his disregard for those he considers to be weak is what ultimately would lead to his demise. He grossly underestimates Clare's strength since she was the weakest of her generation, only to be overwhelmed by her partial awakening. We feel that if he'd been a bit more tempered and cautious, the fight against Clare might have had a different outcome. Ricardo's fighting style relies heavily on his overwhelming speed. This, combined with his ferocity, makes him a frightening opponent. In his battle against the Claymores in Pieta, Ricardo outclasses the female warriors by such a margin that he really sets the tone for what the audience can expect from a single-digit awakened being. Ricardo might not have been the king of the jungle, but there's no doubt his battle prowess made him worthy of his moniker, the Silver-Eyed Lion King. Alysia and Beth. These are the top two warriors of the organization during Clare's time and the events of the final battle. Even though these two warriors can occupy two different slots in this list, we've put them together because their true power lies in their ability, which is called Soul Link. Alysia and Beth were raised from childhood, and they had no sense of self in order to hone this ability, as it required a single body to host two different consciousnesses. Having a zero sense of self means that the assimilation process is much smoother due to the lack of conflicting personalities. Ironically, this is shown to be the case only when they're not using this technique, because during their fights, the audience is shown how the twins are very much concerned about each other's well-being. They even express emotions such as anger, concern, and despair when either one of them is in trouble. We can therefore assume that this lack of individuality is only really necessary and important for the merger of their consciousness. You must be wondering about how any of this psychic power stuff translates to their joint position in this list. Let's fill you in on that now. The Soul Link technique is the most crucial ability in the arsenal of these two warriors, as it allows one of them to fully awaken without losing control, and it even allows the awakened warrior to revert back to her normal state. We know that once a warrior awakens, there's no way for them to regain their humanity. Sure, they can imitate the appearance of a human, but they're forever irrevocably changed. This bypasses that limitation, allowing the organization to have its very own abyssal, which it can control. One must understand that the organization is a dubious bunch, always looking to create the next strongest warrior. It wasn't so much that they had a problem with the awakening of warriors, it was their inability to control these awakened beings, which was the problem. They'd been trying to experiment with Soul Link even as far back as Rafaela and Luciella, which was their first attempt to create an abyssal being that they could control. The only weakness of these two warriors is that if either of the two warriors is mortally wounded, the other is guaranteed to lose control. Alysia, when she awakens, is easily in the same tier as an abyssal one, and is seen taking on the likes of Raiful, Dauf, and even Priscilla. What works against them all is all of the abyssal ones and awakened beings having been around for a much longer time than they have. As such, the twins lack the necessary experience. Despite this, Alysia and Beth are not to be trifled with, and are arguably considered to be the organization's greatest creation. Dauf is the rank 3 warrior of the first generation of Claymore, just like Isley and Ricardo. He's shown as the companion of Raiful of the West, with whom he seems to share a bond akin to love, although their relationship could easily be mistaken for that of servant and mistress. We're told initially that the awakened beings lose all sense of humanity and are merely voracious eaters, but this is proven to be false time and time again as we explore the characters of these beings. Dauf is portrayed as a brute who's not very bright and needs to be constantly directed by Raiful regarding everything. He seems to harbor an intense attachment towards Raiful, making fiercely loyal and protective toward her. Other than his feelings toward his companion, Dauf seems to have no other sense of personality. In his awakened form, he turns into an armored monster with close to impenetrable skin. No ordinary sword strike, even from a claymore, is able to penetrate his armor. We, however, see powerful attacks like Jean's drill sword being able to wound him significantly. He's able to produce rods of varying sizes from different parts of his body, like mouth, arms, and back. Dauf is then able to launch these rods as projectiles at his enemies. He's also able to transform these rods to form various other objects like chains and spears. This monstrous being is also able to alter his size to an extent, which can be seen during 2 separate occasions when he's fighting a newly awakened Katea and then later on, Clare. With the former, he appears about the same size as an ordinary man, but against Clare, he takes on a more hulking form. Like most awakened beings, Dauf has a penchant for violence and shows very little remorse, as can be seen when he's torturing a number of claymores in order to force them to awaken. He's definitely stronger than most awakened beings, as he's seen single-handedly slaughtering several of them belonging to Isley's army. In his rage, he's shown to be strong enough to even overpower a fully awakened Priscilla, although it doesn't last very long. What makes Dauf scary is also his simple-minded nature. He has no idea of good and evil or personal motivation. He's like a loose cannon that'll destroy anything that lies in the direction that Raiful points him toward. Roxan of Love and Hate, one of the 8 strongest number 1 warriors to have ever existed. Roxan is perhaps one of the most powerful and evil Claymore of them all. Her personality makes Ophelia look like an adorable kitten. Formerly ranked 35 in the organization, she'd have a meteoric rise up the ranks, ultimately making her the rank 1 warrior of her generation. However, the circumstances concerning her rise to power would be dubious, to say the least. You see, Roxan had the strangest knack of becoming friends with warriors stronger than her and whose techniques she admired. She'd go to extreme lengths to learn their art, even going so far as to stab herself in the eye while learning the former number 9 Nadine's sensory techniques. After she'd learned the abilities of her friend, that individual would perish not long after under strange circumstances, for example, dying in a hunt against a Yoma or an awakened being far below their level. Roxan wouldn't even mourn their deaths, would soon move on to find a new friend whose technique had captured her interest. She's been described by many of her peers as super creepy. It was this fate that befell upon those she befriended that also earned her the name of the Love and Hate. Roxan's interest would finally be piqued by the then number 1 warrior Cassandra. At the time, Roxan was ranked 5 in the organization and was desperate to find out the secret behind Cassandra's powers. She tried to befriend the Claymore in order to learn her secret. While Cassandra befriends the young girl, she refuses to take her for hunts along with her. Roxan eventually follows her in secret and discovers Cassandra's secret technique, but refuses to copy it, deeming it to be the ugliest technique to have ever been created and used by a number 1. After achieving the 2nd rank in the organization, Roxan would be responsible later on for the torture and murder of a low-ranked warrior who was Cassandra's friend, earning her the number 1 warrior's hatred. Roxan would plot against Cassandra by informing the organization that their top warrior was planning to incite a rebellion. She'd then use this opportunity to kill Cassandra and take over as the new number 1. It's not stated specifically what the reason behind her being able to copy people's techniques so easily and even improve them was. Most speculation suggests that she had the ability to synchronize her yoki with the other person, making her capable of rapidly learning and mimicking their movement and abilities. Her confirmed victims are close to 10 by the time she becomes the top warrior. She would have surely added to that list by the time of her demise. It's further speculated that perhaps she had the ability to manipulate the yoki of others like the organization's rank 10 warriors were known to do. This could prove an explanation as to how some of her victims, who were meant to be far too powerful for their hunt, fell victim to their weaker quarry on such a regular basis. We're not told how or when she died. Roxan is later resurrected by day, along with Hysteria and Cassandra. Even then, she's seen taunting Cassandra, reminding her of her friend's death along with her own. Even as she's getting devoured, Roxan continues to spit venomous words till her last breath. Roxan of Love and Hate is one of the most terrifying and insidious characters to exist in Claymore. Cassandra, the Dust Eater. Having just discussed Roxan, it's only fitting that we now talk about Cassandra, her predecessor, as their fates are intricately tied to each other. Cassandra was the number 1 ranked warrior of the organization, and was considered to be one of the top 8 strongest number 1 warriors in their history, alongside the likes of Hysteria the Elegant, Roxan of Love and Hate, Three-Armed Licht, Heavy-Bladed Chloe, Sistina the Divine Oracle, Lutetia the Universal, and Terasa of the Faint Smile. Even though Cassandra has an aloof personality and is generally feared by her peers, she's shown to be shy and extremely self-conscious when complimented by Roxan during their first encounter. Cassandra was a mystery to many because, according to Roxan, her sword skills were barely good enough for her to be ranked as the 5th strongest warrior in the organization. Yet her superiority was undisputed. She'd always go for hunts alone and refuse any sort of accompaniment. There were only a select few warriors who knew about her true fighting style. Although it was extremely effective and powerful, she was deeply ashamed of it. As Roxan would describe it, when she was using this technique, she looked like she was crawling across the floor and eating dust, earning her the nickname, the Dust Eater. There was only one person who she would totally open up to, but this individual, who was the 35th ranked warrior of her time, would be murdered thanks to Roxan's machinations. Cassandra too would eventually be murdered due to another plot by Roxan to usurp her rank and would die, failing to avenge her friend. Cassandra would later be resurrected along with Hysteria and Roxan by day during the Claymore Rebellion. Miria remarks that Cassandra was probably the strongest abyssal being amongst the 3 newly resurrected former number 1s. She eventually gets her revenge on Roxan by devouring her. During the final battle, she breaks free from Priscilla's control and duels Terasa in her human form. Despite proving to be a formidable warrior by injuring Terasa, she voluntarily retires after having her arm cut off. She expresses gratitude towards Terasa for letting her finally fight all out without any pretense as a proud warrior, disintegrating into the wind with a smile. Luciella, the Empress of the South. Luciella is the former rank 1 warrior of Raphaela's generation and is also the latter's sister. She, along with her sister, would be the organization's first attempt at soul link to create abyssal beings that they could control. Unfortunately for them, Raphaela wouldn't be able to maintain the link, which would result in Luciella not being able to return back to normal. As she awakened fully without restraint, Luciella would go on a rampage and bring the organization to the brink of extinction. She'd injure her sister, destroy one of her eyes, kill multiple trainees and warriors, and destroy their headquarters. Luciella would then move to the southern part of the island and claim that territory as her own. This would establish the tenuous power balance in the land that would exist until her defeat at the hands of Isley. She's then found by Raphaela crawling in her human form, exhausted and wounded after her battle. Upon seeing her sister, she expresses genuine delight and asks Raphaela to awaken so that they can take on Isley together and conquer the rest of the lands. A tearful Raphaela, however, hugs her and ends her life. Not much is known about Luciella's days as a Claymore, but going by her rank and her status as an abyssal being post-awakening, she must have been an extremely powerful warrior. As an awakened being, Luciella was one of the original 3 abyssal beings and was powerful enough that Isley, Riefel, and the organization left her alone for the most part. We therefore feel she's very much earned her place on this list. Riefel, the Abyssal One of the West. This former warrior is hinted to be the first female warrior to have been created by the organization after their first generation of men failed. We see it in a flashback toward the end of the male warriors era, approaching Isley, Ricardo, and Dauf. Riefel is said to be the youngest female warrior to have reached her full potential as the single-digit rank warrior before awakening as the Abyssal of the West. She takes up her abode and controls the western regions of the islands. Just like Luciella, Riefel is one of the original 3 abyssal beings. As a warrior, not much is known about her exploits other than what we've already mentioned. What information we do have about her is during her awakened state, which is how we encounter her for most of the series. She's shown to be highly territorial and in direct opposition to the other 2 abyssal beings. And later on, Priscilla. She often displays a playful disposition even when performing acts of cruelty, like when she kidnapped and tortured a number of Claymores to see them awaken, or when she was torturing Renee in order to prod the consciousness of the fused Raphaela and Luciella. She openly acknowledges her inferiority to Priscilla when she rushes to defeat Isley after his battle with Luciella. Riefel is deterred by the presence of Priscilla, and from thenceforth begins contriving ways to defeat her. Her awakened form grants her nigh invulnerability, as it's almost impossible to slash her. This is because her body's composed of numerous ribbons made out of an unknown substance. Riefel can easily make the blows directed at herself slip past the gaps of these ribbons. Further, she can use these ribbons to attack her foes as well. She proves to be a formidable adversary even for Priscilla, but is eventually cut down. Riefel, despite being an abyssal one and therefore being unbound by the moral codes of humans, is shown to display care and affection for Dauf, despite appearing to treat him harshly. Her personality has a bit of a tsundere element to it with regard to how she treats Dauf. Riefel's presence is felt throughout the series, and she plays an important role during some crucial parts of the story. Her powers can't be denied both as a warrior and an abyssal being, thereby fully earning her spot on this list. Isley, the Emperor of the North. The one known as the White Silver King is perhaps one of the strongest beings to have walked the world of Claymore. He's the former #1 ranked warrior of the very first generation of Claymores, who were all men. During his time as a warrior, Isley is shown to have a very easygoing, laid-back attitude, but we're informed later, mainly by Kronos, the 4th ranked warrior of that time, that it was merely a small side of his personality. Isley is said to have borne a massive sense of responsibility when it came to being the strongest warrior of his generation. It's suggested that he was so strong that he could easily take on all the 7 members of the Ghosts of the North, even in his Claymore days. The Ghosts of the North are no mere pushovers, with almost all of them being as powerful as single-digit warriors. When the men began to succumb to their powers and started awakening one by one, it's said that Isley was the last one to awake. Even then, Isley didn't go through an awakening because he couldn't resist after reaching his limits or was pushed too hard in battle. He awakened of his own free will. How utterly savage is that? It's heavily implied that the only reason he went through awakening is because he felt guilty for being the only male warrior who didn't awaken. Isley is also said to have felt a great sense of remorse for not being able to help his brothers, despite being their leader. Finally, it's speculated that by awakening, he hoped to end his fellow warriors' reign of terror and grant their souls peace. Having been transformed into flesh-devouring monsters with no honor, only governed by hatred and hunger. Unfortunately, when someone goes through awakening, not only are they altered physically, but even their mental state is changed, as their humanity is pushed into the recesses. As an Abyssal One, not only does he rule over the northern regions of the islands, but also commands an entire army of awakened beings. He himself is considered to be the strongest abyssal being out of the original 3 abyssal beings, which is the reason why Priscilla was drawn to him to begin with. He also seems to remember the sword arts of the Claymores, which he teaches Raki to prepare the young boy for his battle against Priscilla. After being hunted by the Abyss Feeders, he sends the boy and Priscilla away from him, showing he still holds a sense of kinship, perhaps regarding them as family. His awakened form resembles that of a centaur of sorts, capable of firing a barrage of homing missiles at his target in rapid succession. Ricardo, who was known for his speed, admits that Isley's speed far outclassed his own. We do know that he's once again weaker than Priscilla after she defeats him in combat. That is, however, not a knock to his powers, because there's only a handful of beings more powerful than Priscilla. The Emperor of the North is a powerhouse and one of the most interesting characters in all of Claymore, well deserving of his place here in this list. The Destroyer. The entity known as the Destroyer is the awakened state of the fused form of Rafaela and Luciella. When Rafaela encounters Luciella after the latter's defeat at the hand of Isley, we see that she breaks her back while hugging her, intending to kill her sister. What we later see is that their bodies have somehow fused and are now in a dormant state. Upon awakening, they take the twisted form of the twin goddesses of love, Terasa and Clare, almost as if in mockery. Unlike the goddesses, the Destroyer, as its name suggests, exists solely to spread destruction and mayhem. It doesn't seem to have any motivation and seems to be functioning purely on instincts. It expels large amounts of parasitic rods over a large radius. If one is impaled by one of these rods, they take over the individual's body and use it as a host to transform into Yoma-like creatures. They, however, do not last forever, and once they've drained their host's life energy, they die. Having been created with the body of an abyssal being, Luciella and her sister Rafaela, who had similar potential, the Destroyer's powers far exceed that of even abyssal ones. She seemed competing on equal footing with Priscilla, who until then had been the only being who had exceeded the abyssal beings. Its true form is shown to be a shapeless dark mass of Yoki, perhaps symbolizing its all-devouring abyssal nature. This is confirmed when Priscilla describes it as being devoid of any attachments, a literal embodiment of the abyss, which simply seeks to destroy everything until nothing remains. We're told that had it not been for the appearance of the Reefal-like being into the fray, the Destroyer would have had the upper hand over Priscilla and was close to taking over her body. This goes to show what a threat the Destroyer is and the scope of its power. If not for the power of plot armor, the Destroyer could have easily ended the Claymore series prematurely, truly living up to its name. Reefal-like being. Toward the end of the series, we're introduced to yet another character who's once again far more powerful than the abyssal ones. Its appearance is very similar to that of Reefal's awakened form, but it combines the ability of Dauf as well. We're not given any name for this character, so we're going to be referring to it as the Reefal-like being, which is what most fans seem to call it. It seems to have combined the strengths of both the original entities and compensated for each one of their weaknesses as well. This entity possesses the wile and craftiness of Reefal with the brute strength and durability of Dauf. Its abilities are, in general, very similar to Reefal and Dauf's. Its body is composed of ribbons, which it can use for both defense and offense, while it's also able to expel the rods, like Dauf. After absorbing the Destroyer, one can say this creature is now an amalgamation of Luciella, Rafaela, Reefal, and Dauf, which in itself should give us an idea of how strong it is, having discussed all of these characters previously. It's capable of absorbing other creatures and their energy, and using that energy for its own benefit. During its fight with Priscilla, it's seen absorbing her excessive powers to augment its own. Later, we see it even absorbing Priscilla's flesh, pushing her regeneration to the limit. This ability is in fact so strong that it makes someone as arrogant as Priscilla, who simply tanks through all attacks, to actually change her tactics. She's only defeated when Priscilla changes herself into her warrior form and uses her Claymore, which is inorganic and hence can't be absorbed by this entity. Aside from Terasa, this character is the only one to force any sort of serious reaction from Priscilla throughout the story. Some people even speculate that the Reefal-like being could possibly be the awakened offspring of Dauf and Reefal, but this hasn't been confirmed anywhere. Regardless, most people would agree that the Reefal-like being is the third strongest entity in all of Claymore. Priscilla, the one-horned monster. The character who's touted as being the strongest character in all of Claymore is unfortunately only the second most powerful according to us. We've already done a deep dive into her character on our channel, so be sure to check that out next time. Priscilla is the overarching antagonist of the Claymore series. She's the first character to be categorized as being beyond an abyssal being. Priscilla was a young girl with a traumatic past whose father was a Yoma that had slaughtered her entire family. After becoming a Claymore, she was almost immediately promoted to the position of rank 2 warrior, owing to her extraordinary potential power. She possessed an intense hatred for the Yoma and an extremely naive understanding of good and bad. Even though Terasa herself admitted that Priscilla had the potential to surpass her, the latter was plagued with a very fragile mentality. Upon being overwhelmed by Terasa, she awakens fully as a monster that towered above everything in existence. Her human subconscious would, however, place a mental wedge where Priscilla would ignore young girls, hoping that a Claymore would rise from amongst them to one day put her down. While she not only retains her sword skills from her warrior days, during her battle with Raki, Clare, and the Ghosts of the North, it's hinted Priscilla has further refined it. Miria even calls it the perfect sword style. During her time as a warrior, she relied on reading her opponent and used her graceful movements to dodge and counter-strike. But as an awakened being, her fighting style is exactly the opposite. As the one-horned monster, Priscilla simply tanks all damage and overwhelms her opponents by sheer force, as she massively outclasses even the strongest beings like the abyssal ones in power. Her regeneration is so strong that it's been likened to the power of creation. Just a single arm of hers was strong enough to power the resurrection of 3 former number 1 warriors and their transformation into abyssal beings. She's also able to absorb other awakened beings and use their abilities as her own. Perhaps Priscilla's greatest feat is killing Terasa during her awakening and setting into motion the primary plotline of the story. She's not just strong, but cunning and devious, as we see during her fight with the Reefal-like being. During her initial battle with Terasa, she manages to surprise the warrior by supposedly suppressing her Yoki. We say supposedly because, according to some, Priscilla's ability was not technically the suppression of Yoki, but the manipulation of Yoki's generation. If one were to suppress their Yoki, the energy still exists in a subdued form, which someone like Terasa would easily sense. Priscilla, on the other hand, is speculated to have had the ability to completely extinguish her Yoki and release it in increments according to her will. This would make sense because, as a fighter, Priscilla didn't require Yoki to sense her opponents. Instead, she relied on an ability akin to Miata's sixth sense. The only reason she went berserk was because Terasa was just that overwhelmingly powerful. Priscilla derives her strength from hatred, and initially we believe that the hatred stems from her feelings towards Terasa, who, despite being a villain in her books, was stronger than her and drove her to awaken. But toward the end of the series, we find out her hatred was directed towards herself for awakening and turning into the very thing she hated the most in the world. A Claymore's strength is influenced by their hatred towards the Yoma, as it is said. Therefore, that explains why Priscilla was such a formidable character, not just as a Claymore, but also as a being that transcended the abyssal ones. If you thought Priscilla in the anime was powerful, wait till you see her in the manga. She's one of the most overpowered characters in all of anime and manga. This still, however, doesn't qualify her to make the top of the list. Honorable mention: Clare. Before we divulge the character that made the top of our list as the strongest character in all of Claymore, we believe there's at least one honorable mention that we'd like to make. And though Clare starts off as the weakest of all the Claymores, by the end of the series, she's probably one of the strongest. Throughout the series, we see her adding new skills to her repertoire, like the Wind Cutter, Quick Sword, and Raffaella's own fighting technique. In the very end, she's able to transform into Terasa, and with their combined power, they're able to destroy the hatred within Priscilla and slay her. It's interesting that Clare isn't the strongest character in the series despite being its protagonist. Unlike the main character in most shows, one could always argue that she's the strongest because her transformation into Terasa is her power as well. We'd certainly not disagree with that completely, but for us, that is still Terasa fighting, complete with her own personality and appearance. It's not as if Clare simply gained Terasa's martial prowess while retaining her own consciousness. When transformed in that state, we're clearly made to understand that the person standing in front of us is no longer Clare, at least for that moment. During the series, no matter how strong she gets, we don't get to see Clare defeating a single high-level awakened one, other than Ricardo on her own. Ricardo is definitely stronger than Dauf, if not at the same level, and Dauf is an opponent Clare is seen not being able to defeat on her own, as she did with Ricardo. In fact, Dauf is someone Clare actively tries to avoid in combat later in the series. One can, therefore, make the argument that Ricardo was too prideful and arrogant to consider Clare a worthy opponent, which prevented him from truly comprehending the threat she possessed and making the necessary adjustments. One can't blame him, because Clare was the weakest warrior amongst the Claymores of the Northern Campaign. Clare is nonetheless worthy of an honorable mention, as outside of the absolute monsters in this list, it's probably the strongest Claymore out there. Terasa of the Faint Smile. Fans of the series probably knew this was coming. For the title of the strongest character in Claymore, we have to choose Terasa of the Faint Smile. And Terasa is the most broken character in the entire series, despite dying right at the start. Hear us out why that is. Terasa is considered to be the strongest number 1 to have ever existed in the history of the Claymores. Her Yoki reserves are so vast that if she'd awakened, it's almost a guarantee that she would have been even stronger than Priscilla, who already surpasses the abyssal beings. As a Claymore, Terasa never utilizes her Yoki to fight against awakened beings and her fellow warriors, as she's just too powerful and doesn't need to rely on its powers. Her ability to sense Yoki is so strong that she can predict her opponent's moves by sensing the Yoki collecting around their various body parts. This grants her an ability that's almost like precognition, making it impossible for people to harm her unless they can absolutely catch her with her guard down or nullify their Yoki. Terasa is capable of sensing Rafaela, who was an expert at covert ops and hiding her Yoki even as a child. Further, during the massacre at Rockwell Hill, she's the one who's truly responsible for bringing down Hysteria. Even if it was someone else who took the killing blow, we rarely see her tap into even 10% of her powers. If memory serves us right, the fight with Priscilla is the second time we ever get a glimpse of her releasing 10% of her Yoki. With a mere 10% of her Yoki, Terasa's able to easily defeat an almost fully awakened Priscilla. If she'd not been careless and let her guard down, she would surely not have been slain. This is confirmed during the final battle when she takes over Clare's body. She's easily able to defeat Priscilla, who's arguably at the peak of her powers. Terasa also defeats Cassandra, one of the 8 strongest number ones just like her, quite decisively. Her strength is so overwhelming that she allows Priscilla to have a second chance by letting her withdraw temporarily to gather her strength, and then proceeds to demolish her once again. Did we mention Terasa is happily chatting with the people on the battlefield while she's fighting against the being who was considered the strongest being in existence? The thing is, as noted by Irene, is that Terasa doesn't have any specialization like Noel's strength or Sophia's speed or even some secret sword technique like Flora's wind cutter. Terasa is just so overwhelmingly strong and special, she doesn't need any specializations. Even her awakening is different. Instead of turning into a monster like the rest, she grows feathery wings and resembles the goddess she's named after. You know that you're the strongest character in the series when the villain is protected by plot armor instead of you, and the author has to kill you off right at the start. Marvelous verdict. The world of Claymore is packed to the brim with dangerous creatures, both human and non-human, whose powers border at the edge of what logic would permit. There's a clear-cut hierarchy of power that's been established throughout the series, whether it's amongst the warriors with their ranks or the Yoma and the world in general. This is definitely not an isekai anime where the protagonist just gains a massive broken ability and solos the entire world. Clare is not at the top of the totem pole when it comes to power, and it really serves the story and her character development well. In keeping with the topic of this video, we've not even discussed the likes of Abyss Feeders and the Asurikam, or Dragonkin as they're known. These are just 2 examples of creatures who could easily make this list. We'll be sure to do a deep dive video exploring these creatures in the future, along with an analysis of the characters mentioned in this video. One might notice a distinct lack of claymores in this list. It's because the series, in no unclear terms, shows us the difference in their power levels compared to the beings mentioned in this list. We'd have loved to include the other 4 number 1 warriors, who were classified as the strongest in history in this list, but little to nothing exists about them or their feats except the mention of their names. The Ghosts of the North, while formidable warriors in their own right, having survived clashes with multiple awakened and abyssal beings, are no match individually to any character mentioned in this list. Their greatest strength lies in their unity and coordination, and even with that, they struggle against these individuals. The unnamed twins, who were meant to replace Alysia and Beth, along with Rafaela, the number 10 warrior, would have all made this list, but unfortunately, there was space for only 14. One thing to be noted is the irony of how a list full of literal monsters is dominated by a monstrous human being. We hope you've been enjoying the Claymore content that we've been putting out, and we appreciate your support as we shed more light on this highly underappreciated gem. Tell us how you feel about this list and give us your own list in the comments section. For now, we've come to the end of this video and we've got to say goodbye. Thanks for sticking with us to the end, and be sure to stay safe and marvelous.